So hi everyone, thanks for joining us. My name is Vicky Farini and I'm part of the GMRT team. I've listed several people here who are actively or have in the past contributed to GMRT and its growth. We're a pretty large team of people over the years working on this. So just wanted to make sure that I acknowledged everyone. Before we get started, Andrew, who is part of the team here, is going to be monitoring the chat box. So if you have questions while I'm talking, don't hesitate to write it down and he will monitor that and interrupt me with the questions as we go. So you don't have to save them until the end. This way it'll be a little bit more interactive instead of me just talking to a screen and not getting any feedback while I go. But it looks like we've got most people joined, so I will get started. Thank you again for joining us today. Oops, click on the right thing. So just to get started, GMRT, the Global Multi-Resolution Topography Synthesis, is a multi-resolutional synthesis of both bathymetry and topography. It is global in extent, hence its name. As part of this infrastructure that we've established, we manage comprehensive metadata to ensure that we provide full attribution to sources of the data that we're bringing together, as well as access to that source data. The compilation is simultaneously maintained in 3 different projections: Mercator, North Polar, and South Polar. And we make the elevation data that we assemble available in a variety of formats. You can access the data as grids, as images, or as profiles, or even points. So we're really trying to open up access to these data, depending on the different use cases. And the way that people can access the data is through an application called the GMRT Map Tool, which is a web application, or through the GeoMap app desktop application, or directly through web services that we've established. So this is a little bit of a summary of what we're going to step through today, and I'm also going to get a little bit deeper into the architecture and how we actually bring the data together. Hopefully answer some questions that some of you have about how we do this. Oops, got to click on the right screen. Okay, so the way that I like to describe GMRT is that it's a combination of 4 sort of discrete tiled multi-resolution elevation components. And I have those pictured here on the bottom. Each of these components are maintained and updated independently and on different schedules, and we bring them together to render images and also generate grids on the fly based on the user's request. So the area of interest and the resolution that they request. And I'm going to describe that in some more detail. But generally, just to go through what these 4 elevation components are, we use GEBCO, currently the 2014 release, which is a roughly 1 kilometer global elevation product. The majority of the ocean in that product is based on predicted bathymetry, so based from satellite altimetry data and gravity. So that fills in most of the sort of low resolution ocean data as the base map. We then have the land topography, which varies in resolution from 10 to 30 meters, depending on which part of the world you're in and which data set the content is sourced from. So that covers the terrestrial areas. And then the 2 parts that we curate most directly and most intensely as part of our effort is the Multibeam component, which is on the right side there at the bottom, and also what we refer to as contributed grids. The contributed grids vary in resolution from 1 meter to hundreds of meters, and the GMRT Multibeam synthesis is gridded at least roughly 100 meter resolution, sometimes better than that, if the data can support it. And so these 4 elevation components are maintained on the back end as discrete tile sets, and we assemble them, as I said, on demand to produce grids on the fly. And we also assemble them with that same logic to generate the image set that you see when you interact with this data. Okay. So just some examples of GMRT, some of the data that's in here. This is Mount St. Helens, so this is obviously terrestrial. Lots and lots of detail that we can see from the data that we've ingested for North America. This, I believe, comes from the USGS North American elevation data set. Here's that content in 3D, so you can see all the detail and explore and zoom in and out as necessary. Another example, this is in the Indian Ocean. This is the MH370 data, or the data that was acquired, rather, for the search for the MH370 airplane crash. So this data was made available by Geosciences Australia. It's in the public domain, so we've been able to get that and integrate it in to this compilation. What you can see here also is what's highlighted is the actual measured bathymetry from the survey that was done, and what's grayed out in the background that has much less definition is the predicted bathymetry that comes through the GEBCO compilation. Another one of my favorite examples of late is from the Argentine Basin. So here we've masked out the predicted bathymetry, and we're just looking at the image rendition of the measured bathymetry data, the multibeam data. If we turn on the grid, you can see more detail and some of that sort of background, very low res elevation information from the predicted bathymetry. If we look at this in 3D, you can actually see the offset vertically between the measured multibeam data and the predicted bathymetry. And also you can see these absolutely spectacular bed forms on the bottom of the seafloor that are on the order of 100 meters tall. So the way that we really bring all this data together is through this multi-resolution architecture. And it's really good for helping us manage and integrate sparse high-resolution data, and to be able to provide access to these different content types at these different resolutions and really deliver it seamlessly to the user. And the way that we manage it very simply is that we have different resolutions of these tiled rasters. And so this image at the bottom shows one of the lower resolution tile sets. It sort of gives you the extent of some of the tiles, right? So each tile is basically a grid in and of itself. If I step through here, we're zooming in basically one level of resolution at a time, closer and closer. You can start to see more and more detail. And now as we get into the higher resolution data, you can see that we don't have a tile for every, we don't have an image for every tile, right? So those black areas there, we don't need to manage anything at this resolution because there's no data there at this resolution, and et cetera, as we go to higher and higher resolution. So this is a very effective way for us to be able to store and manage all of this information without having to keep kind of empty grid cells, basically, for areas that haven't been mapped. So another way to think about this, we basically do this, it's a quad tree subdivision tiling scheme. So if you break an area into 4 boxes, as is shown on the right here, we step in one level of resolution, and each of those boxes gets broken into 4 boxes, step in another level, and each of those is broken into 4. And as we get to higher and higher resolution, we don't need to maintain all of these tiles. So this would be an example of a full matrix of tiles at high resolution, but what we do is we just manage it for places where we actually have data. So this helps us, again, minimize disk space and really optimize storing and delivering the data to our users. Another important thing to note here is that the directory structure and the tile name, the convention that we use for that actually carries the geospatial information. So the raster files themselves can be very compact because we don't have to put latitude and longitude inside of each of those raster files, just elevation. So here's an example of, just to illustrate this again, here's a single pass of a ship track running a multi-beam sonar. The background is the sort of blurred out predicted bathymetry. If I turn on the mask, that should just gray out and really highlight where the measured bathymetry from the multi-beam is. And if I turn on the tile names, you'll see that for this particular pass of the multi-beam, we don't have a tile, right, for every one of these. I don't have to store it. So to describe the grid composer for you, I like to use this little cartoon. So we basically, as I said, have these 4 elevation components. In this rendition, the sort of coarser background gray image or gray grid, the GEBCO, roughly 1 kilometer resolution. The green is the higher resolution land topography. The multibeam that we curate, the 100-meter multibeam, is the sort of lighter blue hatch mark. And then the contributed grids, which are at different resolutions, as I said, are the orange. And so these data sets can exist in spatially distinct or spatially overlapping areas. And so what we do by having these 4 separate tile sets is we can bring those together and have our software, which we call the Grid Composer, bring them together in a logical way to deliver the best resolution for the user, for the area that was requested, and at the resolution that was requested. So the way I'm going to show you that is if we just pick up an area of the ocean that might be requested by a user, the Grid Composer first looks at the contributed grid content at the highest resolution that was requested. And so here we have a very high resolution survey around a Pacific island. Then we query the elevation data for the land topography. So the island just turned green, it filled in there. After that, we add the multibeam content. So here's a single passive multibeam going past this island. And then we come back and we fill it in with the predicted bathymetry from the GEBCO compilation. So this gives us a complete matrix, basically, a complete raster of elevation data. And then depending on what the user requests in terms of resolution, we can put grid nodes across that at whatever spacing is requested. So it could be 100-meter, it could be 50-meter-ish. So basically this is trying to show you, we basically have the content at the resolution that it's available. And if you request a grid that is of higher resolution than the source data, we basically will impose those nodes and super sample, if you will, the content to deliver the grid that you've requested. Hopefully that made sense. And definitely, as I said, stop me if you have questions. So following through, again, here's the 4 elevation components. And really what we're doing for the terrestrial content and the GEBCO content is we're converting the available data sets into our tiled multi-resolutional scheme. So it's a straight up conversion so that it fits into our architecture. Where we do most of our curation and effort is to prepare multibeam swath files for integration. And I'm going to dive into that in the next few slides. And we also do a fair amount of curation as we integrate these regional or contributed grids. There's some work that we do to get them to be consistent with one another and also to have them interact well with the multibeam data that we're curating. So in terms of the multibeam data preparation, we grid all the data that comes in to roughly 100-meter resolution. I say roughly 100-meter because we're using a Mercator projection, and then we have to resample it to lat long, and there's latitudinal variation because of the nature of projections, but roughly it's 100-meter resolution. Most of the swath data that we bring into the compilation is sourced from the US academic fleet. The cleaning that we do really can't easily be automated. A lot of the work, a lot of the data that's available is transit data. So it's a single pass as the ship is going from one place to another. In instances where there's a lot of back and forth and a survey is run and we have a lot of overlap during a particular cruise, it's a little bit easier to use filters to clean the data. But when you have a single line without the context of adjacent area mapped, it's really hard to automate that. You have to look at the data and use your understanding of both multibeam and geology to make good decisions about how to clean the data. And even then, you really need sometimes additional context to make sure that the sound velocity is correct. And I'll show you that, some examples of that in a bit. We try to target 60 to 80 cruises a year for processing and integration. As I said before, we maintain access to all the source swath files, so you can actually click through and find the source files if you need to do more advanced processing or work with those data files. We're also generating data processing reports, and there's an example of that on the right here. We're basically telling you how many files we processed, what the ship track coverage is, what the total area mapped is, and we're also plotting extinction plots or creating extinction plots. And what these are simple ways of seeing the functional performance of the multi-beam system in terms of swath width as a function of depth. And so after we clean the data, we're showing you here if we're getting 3 times the water depth, 4 times the water depth, whatever it might be. And it does vary with depth. And the idea here is that it can help the community as they go out to use these ships to do perhaps some actual surveys and figure out how far to space their lines apart. So you can tell from the performance of the system at the water depth that you're going to be working in, how to make those decisions a little bit more intelligently before you go.
Vicky, the 100-meter resolution refers to the horizontal resolution. What can a user expect from GMRT for the vertical resolution?
So vertical resolution in terms of the depth, we're mostly working with deep water systems here. We're not doing tide corrections because that's sort of lost in the details with the resolution that we're looking at. We're certainly on the order of tens of meters, I would say. Some places it's better, some places it might be a little worse. We're really trying to optimize getting coverage where we can. So sometimes where data are very, very sparse and maybe lower quality, we'll take the data into the synthesis because it's better than no coverage. And other places we're a little bit pickier because there's more data available and we can be more strict with our quality kind of criteria. Does that answer your question, Andrew? Well enough?
Yeah, that's fine, thanks.
Yep. So I have a note here that we use MB System, and I'll get a little bit more into that down the road. It's certainly not the only data processing tool that we use, but it is a big part of what we use because it can be integrated into the sort of automated engine of tiling that we do and gridding. So we do a fair bit of coordination with this project across the US academic fleet. And there are 2 other complementary projects that are focused on ensuring that high quality publicly available bathymetry data are acquired and actually made available. So one of them is the Multibeam Advisory Committee, which is called the MAC, which really focuses on data acquisition. The plot that I showed you of the extinction plot actually comes from work done in that project. I'm one of the PIs on that, so we have very close connection there. The Rolling Deck to Repository program, R2R, has been in existence for about a decade and has done a terrific job of ensuring that multi-beam data collected on the US fleet is delivered to the NOAA archive. And that's really opened up the fire hose of data for us to be able to make use of and integrate into GMRT. And there's lots of people on the GMRT team who are part of the R2R project, and Suzanne Carbat, who I think is listening in, is the lead PI on that project as well. So there's, again, a good amount of coordination between the projects. R2R does some quality assessment work, which helps to inform our decision-making process when we try to prioritize data that's suitable to get into GMRT. So there's a good feedback there. And as we work through the data in GMRT and really start to see sort of systematic problems with particular systems or particular vessels, we can feed the information back to partners at R2R and the MAC to help optimize operations and practices to make sure that we're getting the best product that we can. So for the multi-beam data workflow, we're really, as I said, using MB System as our engine in conjunction with Java, which is what the tiling code was initially developed in. And so we can take in either raw multi-beam files, so swath files, or processed multi-beam files. So since we can read basically any format that MB System can read, if someone including ourselves, processes data with something like Keras or Chimera, we can read files that those software packages export and push them through our same pipeline, create the tiles, look at the data in the context of other GMRT data, which is very helpful. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. And it allows us to iterate and really look at, kind of build the puzzle where the pieces actually are of the same shape and size, and splice this together. And so after we push the data through this process, either just kind of as a quick check or as an iterative process where we actually do cleaning, we end up with processed multi-beam files, which we store so that we can regenerate tiles from them if necessary. We have a suite of metadata that we extract from those files, and then we have the tiled images, grids, and mask layers that get integrated into the GMRT tile set. So some examples of problems, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that we're looking for to fix. This is an example from a data set that was delivered to us as a cleaned data set, I believe. And there was one pretty big hole that appeared along the profile that's shown there that was significantly offset from the seafloor. So we'll go through and do checks and try to spot these things. And if we see those, we'll clean them up before we integrate it so that we can try to get the best quality surface to integrate into the compilation. If we kind of look at the data in its ping form, so I'm not sure how many people are accustomed to looking at it this way, but we're looking at a whole bunch of swaths stacked on top of each other here. This is in MB system. In this example, you can see the green dots are data that have been automatically flagged out by the system itself during acquisition. The red is what has been edited out by a human. And in this example, we actually see a place where the data was over-edited. So that large clump of red that shows up in the middle of the black profile is actually perfectly fine data that someone edited out for who knows what reason. So sometimes we clean data out, sometimes we put data back in if we're getting the processed files delivered to us. This is an example of just some bad data where the seafloor was misdetected and the sonar's filter caught some of the problems, but not all of it. Here's a really ugly example of just this sort of ringing pattern that we see when the data is just very, very noisy. We have to clean a lot there, it takes a lot of time. This is an example of kind of the power of looking at this data in the context of the rest of the compilation. And so what we're looking at on the left is the north-south trending survey line that looked a little bit suspiciously slanted, sort of tilted to the east. And so we could find a place within the rest of the GMRT compilation where that track line overlapped with existing integrated data, and indeed could identify that there's a pretty big roll bias that somehow appeared in this data. For this particular cruise, what's weird is that it is not persistent throughout the entire cruise. So someone during acquisition did something to the system and changed the roll bias, and we're seeing the effect of it here. So the profile plot, we're actually profiling across both the GMRT compilation, and which is a red line, and the black is the single pass of the multi-beam. Interesting to note is on the where the distance is 14 to 16 in that profile, the black and the red lines line up pretty nicely. That's because this data file, as it was made available in the NOAA archive, was gridded directly into the, I believe into the SRTM, which was then migrated into the GEBCO grid. And that roll bias was propagated into that grid. And so that place where it overlaps and is consistent is because that's an area where in GMRT there is not actually measured bathymetry, but it's predicted. And so it's really helpful to be able to tease these problems apart and actually get a more correct rendition of the shape of the seafloor. So in terms of data curation, here's just some metrics of where we're at as of our last release, which was several months ago. So with GMRT version 3.6, which is what's publicly available right now, just from the Multibeam that we've curated, which is 1,046 cruises of Multibeam. That covers about 8.6% of the ocean. It's built from about 250,000 swath data files, which have over 213 million individual pings, and there's over 31 billion points, so XYZ points that have gone into just this piece of the compilation. Just the swath files themselves are almost 5 terabytes of file size, and the tile set itself, the Multibeam tile set is much, much smaller than that. It's certainly less than 1 terabyte. So as I said before, we're able to really distill this content into a much more manageable volume. The data that has been integrated through our Multibeam curation dates back as far as 1980. And as of the last release, went up to 2018. The new release, which is coming out in the next couple of weeks, it's going to add 60, maybe a few more than 60 cruises, and will certainly extend the coverage pretty significantly, because we've got some pretty exciting data that's coming out in that release. So if we move on to the contributed grids component, this screenshot here shows the global compilation. I have the mask turned on to highlight the areas of high resolution. These different colored lines that show up here in polygons indicate where the contributed grids exist. So some of them are big boxes, some of them are sort of sparse trackline, almost grids spliced together. All of these are basically assembled into its own multi-resolutional tile set. We have to recompute that tile set with every release of GMRT, because we do some curation to make sure that each of those grids is consistent with adjacent ones. We want to make sure that there's no vertical offsets. We also want to make sure that we make intelligent decisions about how the Multibeam content that we curate, so the rest of that high-res content in the oceans there, interacts with these grids. So do we want the grids to overprint the Multibeam? Do we want the Multibeam to cut through those grids? Do we want to limit the grids based on the depth? Or do we want to, do we have to apply vertical offsets to the grids? All these things happen as part of that curation effort. So, and I should also say that these grids are also available within GeoMap app for direct access. So you can view them independently in there. So for the GMRT version 3.6, we have 81 of these contributed grids that have been integrated. They come from 10 countries, and one of those is the EU, so it's actually more than 10 countries. The minimum source grid resolution is 5 meters and the maximum is 1 kilometer. So again, different resolutions, and we're really trying to bring it together to deliver to the users the best solution that we can. So for accessing GMRT, there's really 3 pathways. There's the GMRT map tool, GeoMap app, which is the desktop application, and then we have web services. I'm going to step through these briefly in slides, and then I'm going to try to open up my browser and give you a very quick demo of how to navigate these tools. So GMRT map tool is deployed on the Amazon cloud. It allows users to extract images, grids, profiles, and also point elevations as they mouse around. You get an elevation right under the cursor. And it's really driven by all of our web services. So this is a nice way to make sure that our web services are always functioning, because we're actually using them in our interfaces. It's available in 3 different projections, just like the rest of GMRT. So Mercator, South Polar, and North Polar. And users can go in and request data based on their area of interest. Using GeoMap app, of course, GMRT is the default base map. You can make your custom grids and images, much like with the map tool. You can also click on the track lines here and gain access to the source swath files. You can identify data gaps. So if you're going out to collect new data, you can work to help fill gaps in mapping coverage. And there's even a function in GeoMap app to plan survey lines and actually plan surveys. The web services that we have really fall into 2 categories. We have Open Geospatial Consortium, OGC services. Those are primarily web map services. Again, in all the projections, the details are there, but I brought a few examples of different interfaces that are using the GMRT web map service. So basically, this service allows any application or web app or other app to access the GMRT images that we've assembled and integrate that into the application. The REST type services are the ones where the user can declare geospatial information and extract grids, images, metadata, profiles, and points. And there's even a service that allows you to put in a large area of interest and request a series of URLs that you would use to download all of the high resolution pieces that would cover that whole area. Because we've got some limits on how large of a grid we can deliver to you, just based on the number of nodes that we have to bring together. So you can't, for example, request in one grid the entire globe at 100-meter resolution. You would have to come into this URL service and get a list of URLs to execute to get that area broken into several pieces. All right, so if I can figure out how to change what I'm sharing. One second. Okay, so that should be my browser. Andrew, can you confirm?
Yeah, we can see your browser window.
Thank you. So this is the GMRT homepage. When you get to the homepage, just very briefly, there's an interactive map here that shows the trackline coverage for the various releases of GMRT. It starts with the most recent one first. This is interactive, so you can click on a particular track of interest and actually make your way in to download data or view other information about the cruise. Likewise, for contributed grids, you can click on, let's see, I'll choose this one. Click on the grid, and if you follow this through, it actually takes you to the data set, wherever it may be, whether it's in one of our systems that we manage at Lamont or another system. Then just very briefly, the GMRT map tool is here under tools. You can draw a box of interest, create a grid, choose your format, your resolution, and download. You can download an image based on that area chosen. You can also draw a profile, and it will build that for you, and you can download that in a variety of formats. You can change projections. You can turn the masks on. This is a browser weird thing. There we go. Okay, so hopefully those are pretty easy to navigate. The web services are all documented here. So under tools again. Information about data sources is on this page. So we're basically giving you a list of some of them here in sort of a preview mode, or you can click through and see all of the cruises that have been integrated. So it's a pretty long list, picking at random here. So here's the data report with the extinction plot and some other metrics. And if we zoom in, we've actually got polygons that we've created around every swath file. So if I turn on the mask, you'll see how that lines up with the extent there. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to show on this page. So now I'm going to very briefly show you GeoMap app, which hopefully you're familiar with. But again, this is the base map. With respect to crediting sources, the flags on the bottom indicate the countries whose data are integrated based on the view. So as I zoom in, it's going to change. The info button here gives you the list. Well, I don't know if you're going to see that. It's a different window, but it gives you the list of all the cruises and the grids that have been integrated. Again, that responds based on where you're zoomed in on the map. and there's links there to go to the source data. If you turn on the mask, it's going to highlight where the high resolution data exists. To turn on the grid, push that button, and it takes a minute because it's doing that rendering. And it will respond every time you zoom and pan. And then I guess the only other thing to show you here is, this will take just a second to load. This is going to bring up the track lines for all the source data. It's a big file, so it takes a minute. I should have pre-cached it, apologies. But this way you'll know that when you do it yourself, it's behaving as it's supposed to. I think we're almost there. Get ready to go back to my slides. Oh, all right. Oh, here it is. All right, so there's some track lines. If you click on one, it highlights the whole cruise in white and an individual file in red. It gives you the file down on the bottom, and you can actually go and download that file, which probably you can't see because that's not the window I have shared. But just that gives you a good sense, hopefully, of where the different components are. All right, so I have just a couple more slides, and then we can take questions or have whatever discussion people need to have or are interested in. The Nippon Foundation GEBCO Seabed 2030 project, which you may or may not have heard about, is a collaborative project between the Nippon Foundation and GEBCO to inspire the complete mapping of the world's ocean by 2030 and to compile all bathymetric data into the freely available GEBCO map. So I've referred to GEBCO as I've sort of gone through things, but to give you some context, GEBCO has been in existence for over 100 years, and it has the goal of creating a complete global ocean map. It is operated under the auspices of the International Hydrographic Organization, which is based in Monaco, and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO. GEBCO and the Nippon Foundation. The Nippon Foundation is a large philanthropic organization in Japan, which has a lot of interest in the marine sector. And they've been working with GEBCO for the past roughly 15 years to develop and sponsor a training program that has been really growing the membership of GEBCO internationally and getting a new generation of people involved and really sharing knowledge across the world. So the training program takes place at the University of New Hampshire. And every year there are 6 students that come in through this program, and they get a postgraduate certificate in ocean mapping. And it's really been a great success at growing the community within GEBCO. And so GEBCO and the Nippon Foundation have joined forces to really strive toward this very ambitious goal of mapping the entire ocean by 2030. Our best estimates right now are that only 15% of the global ocean is mapped with direct observation. So it's a huge task to undertake, and it has to be done internationally. And so we're really working hard to figure out how to make this happen and really accelerate the pace at which we're doing things. The project has established several regional data centers, one of which I lead at Lamont, focused on the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The others are distributed around the world, focused on different parts of the ocean. So that's just a little context about Seabed 2030, and I wanted to point out that we are contributing the GMRT Multibeam compilation to GEBCO, to Seabed 2030. And so this shows the global extent of the GMRT version 3.5 data set, again, just the Multibeam component, which was contributed to GEBCO and made available in the GEBCO 2019 grid. And so we basically have a very nice pathway by which to leverage GMRT to help deliver data from the US academic fleet into this global compilation and play our part to contribute the data that we as sort of the US research community acquire and make available and really ensure that it gets integrated into this international product. So what's next with GMRT? Of course, ongoing growth of content. Version 3.7, as I said, will be released in the next couple months. So it's going to get us up over 1,100 cruises total in the compilation. Last time I looked at the NOAA archives, there were on the order of 3,000 multibeam cruises of data in there. So we've got about a third integrated. I should have pointed out that part of what we do as we look at data and review it for the potential for integration is we sometimes omit data if it doesn't add coverage or if it's of very low quality or if it can't be processed. So we've certainly looked at more than 1,100 cruises of data. We're also going to be working toward optimizing our cloud deployment and, of course, enhancing our curation tools and services. And one of the most exciting things, at least for me, is we're going to work to make our tiling code for the QA and QC of multibeam data distributable. So the idea there is that if you're on a cruise and you're processing multibeam data on the cruise, or perhaps you're doing it in the lab and you're working through that data, you can take the code that we're using to build the tiles for a specific cruise, build the tiles, look at that data in the context of GMRT, make whatever changes you need to make to get that to be very high quality, and then help to contribute that data into the tile set. And so the idea here is that we can really alleviate the bottleneck that is a relatively small team of people working hard to process data every year and really help to engage the community a little bit more broadly in this effort. So in summary, I just wanted to say that the way that I think of GMRT is that it's kind of 4 different things. It's a multi-resolutional data synthesis. It's an infrastructure for delivering elevation data in a variety of formats, as I've discussed. It's a tiling scheme for efficiently storing and delivering the data that's maintained in 3 projections simultaneously. And it's a scalable methodology for QA, QCing multibeam data, and it's really well suited for doing this with data that's acquired during transits because the underlying GMRT data set can give you that context necessary to know if there's a roll bias or a small sound velocity problem that you might not otherwise notice. And it's going to help us, I think, build this global map as we come together internationally to answer the big call of Seabed 2030. So it's a very exciting time in ocean mapping. With that, I'm going to stop talking and open up for questions. I hope you have some. And you can always, of course, send us questions at info@marinegeo.org anytime.
Vicky, I'll start off with a question. If someone has a grid that they wish to contribute to GMRT, how do they go about doing that?
Great question, Andrew. So the best way is to, you can send us an email at info@marinegeo.org, and we can route you to the best mechanism. Typically, depending on where the data is from, we might seek to ingest it into another data system that we manage, marinegeo.org, and sort of cross over from there into GMRT. Otherwise, we can just tile it up and get it integrated directly. So it kind of depends on where the data is coming from. And then we'll figure out with people what the most efficient data transfer mechanism is. We typically, these days, use some sort of cloud sharing technology. But once we have the grid, we can tile it up pretty quickly and make it available pretty quickly.
And as we wait for other questions to come in, I'm going to follow with another one. And that is, if people wish to download high-resolution GMRT data for a fairly sizable area, is it relatively easy to create the web service URLs?
Yeah, so if you go to the web service, services webpage on the GMRT site, there's documentation for all of the web services, including ways to help you construct those URLs, kind of walk you through it. And so that's true for any of those services. I think one of the highly valuable and very overlooked services that we offer is also the point service. So for example, if you had a bunch of stations, sampling stations, and you needed depth values for all of them, you could feed those lat-long positions into that service and get a Z value, depth value out programmatically and not have to do it one by one. But all of the services have, I I think, pretty good documentation. It's generally a little bit technical. So if people have questions on how to navigate that, certainly send us an email and we can help you out.
Vicki, this is Jessica Warren.
Hello.
Hi. I have a question about the resolution. So I guess I should say first, this has been really helpful, so thank you for doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at the online map tool, and I just was playing around and downloaded a grid. Is that data, because the data, like when I view it through GeoMap app, is gridded at this 100-meter resolution for the Multibeam data. This, if I download through the web tool, is it potentially at higher resolution if it was gridded at higher resolution by the crews, or is that not the case?
No, so the web tool and GeoMap app are accessing the same content.
Okay.
And it's all basically been reformatted into this tiling system. And so each of the interfaces has a slightly different, I guess, limit on, or I don't want to say limit, but a slightly different way that it figures out the resolution that it's going to deliver to you. So certainly the west, east, south, north extent that you request is part of it. Again, we can't deliver too many grid nodes because the server can't really keep up. So if you're not getting what you want in terms of resolution, you could go to that URL builder and get multiple requests to get a bunch of grids downloaded, if that makes sense. And yeah, so as I said, we tend to do, we always do every multi-beam cruise data set at least 100-meter resolution. The logic as it is set up right now requires that the whole cruise be gridded at the same resolution. And so if the cruise is focused primarily in shallow water, we can push that resolution to be higher, 50-meter, 25-meter, 12.5-ish meter, even half of that, right? So it really depends on the extent of the cruise. That sort of dictates, what we're gridding it at to put it into the compilation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
And Vicki, there's a lot of interest in shoreline crossing studies at the moment. So are there plans to integrate any shoreline LiDAR data in GMRT?
There's certainly no major barrier to doing that. I will say, though, that, as we get into shallower water, well, LiDAR will make it a little bit easier because of the tide issue. But as we get into shallower water and higher resolution data, vertical offsets become more of an issue than they are in the deep sea with ship-based multi-beam. So we might have a little more work to do there. But technically, there's no limit on what we bring in terms of, as long as it's a grid, we can read it in. There's a question in the group chat. Did that answer your question enough?
Yeah, thanks.
Is there a way to sort your data by resolution size? I don't think I understand that question. Okay, so the previous question, which is there a way to sort your data by resolution size? I need a little more on that one to answer it. Another question that just came in was, which software tools other than MB System do you use? So for data processing, for the swath data, we use Chimera. It's a very nice, easy interface, and it's a particularly easy interface for new people that are less familiar with swath data to work with. And it gives you the immediate feedback from sort of the ping editor to the grid. So that works really well. We could use Keras. We just don't tend to use that in-house. But if those are, I think, the two most popular swath editing suites that are out there, and both of them do export a format called GSF, which is generic sonar format. and that is a format that MB system can read. So it's a nice way to be able to use those tools and still push the swath files through our engine to do the tiling with our scheme. I think that answered that question. So back to the previous one, so you can see where high resolution files are located, verse 100. So this is an interesting question. At present, there is no way to show in a map where the high resolution data exists other than turning on the mask. And as you may have noticed with the mask, the logic there isn't totally perfect because some of those gridded areas that might be lower resolution show up as high res in the same way that the 100-meter multi-beam does. And it would be really nice to have a visual representation to show where the highest resolution content is. So we don't have a function to do that yet, but I could see ways that we could pull that together and make it accessible to help people understand, you know, what the resolution of the underlying source data is, sort of as a layer in the map tool, for example. So that's a great suggestion and something that I think we could achieve pretty easily. Okay, next question. Are you collecting and collating information on sound velocity profiles in different parts of the global ocean? So technically, that is sound velocity information is certainly, you know, integrated in the swath data, the multi-beam data processing suite. We do extract sound velocity profiles from the files as part of the processing. We do corrections to sound velocity profiles. Sometimes there's a lot of corrections that have to happen depending on what part of the ocean we're in. And I was recently thinking about how that should be contributed back out to some other effort that's really looking at the water column data. So I would say that there's not yet a strong connection on pushing that information out, but that's certainly something that we can and probably should look at doing. Anybody else?
So Vicky, another question. Is it possible in GMRT using the mask function to see the difference between two releases? So when 3.7 comes out, can we see just the cruises that were added for 3.7 compared to the previous version?
So not at present, but I certainly would like to see us improve the mask logic. At present, we have a single, in theory, we could extract it from old releases, but we don't yet make that available. The best way right now to do it would be just to look at the differences in the track line coverage for the different releases. So it's kind of the inverse of what you're asking. It would show you all the cruises that are added, well, sort of the cumulative cruises for each release. We certainly have the information in the back end and we could set that up, but it does not yet exist. But that's another great suggestion. Another question here is about collecting or processing backscatter data or trying to characterize the seafloor somehow. So we currently don't do anything with backscatter data. If it was recorded and it's part of the swath file, we certainly don't lose it, not intentionally anyway, but we're not looking at that ourselves. My own attempts to look at the ship-based backscatter in the deep sea hasn't typically yielded too much very useful data, but I haven't delved too deeply into that. But that is certainly, I know, of interest to the broad international research community, and I think we'll see progress on that in the coming years. I'm not sure if it'll necessarily be part of GMRT, but hopefully we can contribute the work that we've been doing into an effort that would be looking toward that. And in fact, with the Multibeam Advisory Committee, we've mostly focused on the bathymetry side of things. We've done a little bit of work with the backscatter, but not a huge amount. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity there, I would say. But it is being collected at least. Okay, question. How should GMRT be cited or credited if it is used in a publication? So currently, we ask people to cite the paper that came out in 2009 that described GMRT and how it's set up, which is it's Ryan et al. 2009. It's a G-cubed paper. There's certainly reference to that in the GMRT website and also within GeoMap app, since it's the base map there. Hopefully we'll have another publication in the relatively near future that can be also cited. But at least citing Ryan et al. Is a good start. Okay, next question. Tell us more about the donation process if we have in-house Multibeam archives. So I guess the answer to that kind of depends on where you are. So if you're US based, we can certainly help get that content into the system, also into the public NOAA archives, which, so the NOAA archive, which is out in Boulder, Colorado, serves both as the US National Archive and also the IHO Data Center for Digital Bathymetry. So in theory, all raw multi-beam sonar data should reside there, and they have served that role for several decades now. So there are tools that are under development that are helping to make it easier to submit data to those archives. So I see that this is Canadian data. So I would say we can certainly help route you in the right direction to get that data to the IHO DCDB, which is the NOAA archive. And I know there are some people on the phone or on the call that, or at least there were, who work at that archive and might be able to provide additional information. But just send me an email or send us an email and I can help point you in the right direction. But we certainly, I would say in the context of Seabed 2030, it's really hugely important that we get all existing data wherever we can into the public domain so that we can fill in the map as best we can with the resources that have already been acquired before we send out more ships to collect new data. Okay, Giuseppe, redistributable grid code. Yes, so the goal here is to take the few scripts that we use that open the swath files and generate the tiles at the roughly 100-meter resolution in our tiling scheme, and then allow you to view that gridded data in the context of the publicly available GMRT compilation using GeoMap app. So really just, so the idea is if you're at a different institution or if you're on a ship, you can have a portable GeoMap app disk that runs in an offline mode. And if you, basically the requirements are going to be that you have MB system to be able to open up the files and feed the XYZ points to our gridding algorithm. It'll run the gridding algorithm, make the tiles both as dynamic grids that the color changes as you pan around, and also as images. Then you can take the GeoMap app tool, open up that tile set, look at it, interrogate it within the context of the version of GMRT that you have either on your portable GeoMap app disk, or if you're in the lab at an institution on shore, you can just connect to the public version of GeoMap app and look at the content. So really trying to get that tiling code distributed so other people can do the work of reviewing the data once it's tiled up in our scheme. I guess I should say you would probably be surprised, because I am surprised regularly at when we look at the data in something like Chimera, it looks like it's clean and ready to rumble, and then we take the same files and we grid them with our gridding algorithm and look at it in the context of GMRT, and we see some problems. So it's sort of an extra level of QA, QC that can be done to make sure that that data is ready to drop into the compilation. You're welcome. All right, any other? Okay. So as I said, if any questions come up at any time, just shoot us an email and we will do our best to get back to you quickly. Thank you again for joining us. I hope that this was informative. We are going to, we've been recording this, so we're going to, I think, post the video so it can be looked at again, and I can also post the slides. So we'll send an email to everyone with the information about that so you can access those resources on your own. All right. So I think with that, Andrew, I defer to you to.
If there are no more questions, thank you everybody for participating in the webinar, and thanks a lot, Vicky. That was super informative.
Thank you. All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.